We've called our new report Tainted Peace because despite the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka back in May 2009, torture hasn't ended. It's been ongoing in every year since the conflict ended and right up to the present day. Our doctors reviewed 148 cases of torture that happened in Sri Lanka since the end of the civil war. And in 94% of those cases, the victims were Tamils, who were targeted primarily because they had real or perceived links with the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers as they were known. Torture is deeply entrenched in the Sri Lankan policing and security apparatus. In many of the cases, the torturing agent was the military, in other cases the police, and in other cases the Criminal Investigation Department and other branches of the intelligence community in Sri Lanka. There are many torture methods that are used extensively in Sri Lanka, including beating. 100% of the cases in our study involved people who'd been beaten on various parts of their body using different implements. Burning is also very, very common. In more than 3/4 of our cases, the victim had been burned either with cigarettes or with a heated metal implement or another substance. Sexual torture is also very common. More than 70% of the cases, including both men and women, had suffered forms of sexual torture, often including rape. Torture is deeply entrenched in the Sri Lankan policing and security apparatus. There has been very little concrete moves made to eradicate torture, and we have seen very little in the way of accountability for those who are responsible for torture in the military, in the police and in the intelligence sector. So it's very well known that in the final stages of the Sri Lankan Civil War, torture and other international crimes were committed on a very large scale. And there is a lot of international pressure for a proper accountability process. And Freedom from Torture's view is that for a genuine accountability process to be effective, it must be human rights compliant. And it also must involve a very strong international component at every stage and at every level of the process. Otherwise, the process will not win the confidence of the victims, including from the Tamil minority. The UK government needs to be applauded for the leadership role they've taken in calling for accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. We'd like them to be calling on Sri Lanka to be becoming a very active participant in the Preventing Sexual Violence initiative. But there is also a very, very important move for the government to make in relation to its asylum policy. One of the most alarming findings from our research is that in more than 1/3 of the 148 cases we looked at, the survivor had been tortured after returning to Sri Lanka from the UK. In most of those cases, they'd been targeted for torture because of a real or perceived association with the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers, often at a very low level, and in some cases because of a wrongful association. In other words, they didn't have any links with the Tamil Tigers but were assumed by the authorities to do so. In view of these findings, we are calling on the Prime Minister to personally ensure that the UK's asylum policy is updated urgently to reflect the evidence that we have put forward about ongoing torture in Sri Lanka, particularly when it comes to those who are returning to Sri Lanka from the United Kingdom, who we suspect will be targeted for torture if they have a real or perceived association with the Tamil Tigers at any level.
A medical legal report is a detailed assessment of both the account of torture that the person has suffered and then a full physical and psychological examination to see the impact of the torture on them. The doctor will do an examination to record all the marks, scars and lesions on their body as a result of the torture, and a psychological assessment to see the impact of the torture on them now. In the course of my career, I've probably examined well over 1,000 victims of torture and organised violence. In the Sri Lankan survivors of torture that we've been seeing, what really strikes me is the range of different torture methods that they've experienced. So we see evidence not just of blunt force torture, but also of burns with cigarettes, burns with heated metal objects. We see people who've been kept in solitary confinement for a very prolonged period, who've been subjected to asphyxia tortures with plastic bags, with chili or petrol in the plastic, and they've been suspended, often upside down. So there's a whole range of different forms of torture which are repeated over and over in this group. The Istanbul Protocol is the United Nations manual to be used for the investigation and documentation of torture, and we use it extensively in our reports and in training doctors. It sets out all the core forensic medical principles for this type of work. It gives a lot of clinical information about torture and the impact of torture on people. And it has these very important ways in which we can assess the level of consistency of injuries as compared to other possible causes or torture. Other important principles that we use, for example, are the fact that torture may not leave any physical evidence, and it describes why this may be so. Some methods are specifically designed not to leave lasting physical evidence on the person. When I see survivors of sexual violence, one of the big difficulties for them really is in just talking about it at all. As you can imagine, such an awful, shameful, frightening experience is very difficult to talk about to a stranger. And although we know that many of the victims of torture from Sri Lanka that we see will have suffered sexual violence, that's one thing for us to know and quite another for the person to be able to talk about it in any detail. And this is the first thing we have to do, is to establish the trust and rapport that will enable that person to feel safe, that they want to trust the person with this awful experience that they've been through.
I've been a psychotherapist and psychiatrist at Freedom from Torture since 2001, and the kind of problems that survivors of torture from Sri Lanka present with are flashbacks. That's incredibly intense reliving of traumatic experiences which can come during the day or at night. Also, they can experience nightmares and insomnia. They can wake up in the middle of the night screaming or shouting and sweating as they remember past traumas. And they dream about it in a very frightened state, and it might need their partner or a friend to reassure them and to calm them down. They can also be quite avoidant. They can be fearful of seeing somebody like a policeman because that reminds them of the person who tortured them, and that might trigger off a flashback. They can have problems of meeting with people because they can be quite suspicious. They're frightened of people. They might be scared that somebody's going to attack them again, so they can be hypervigilant. They can be looking around, trying to see whether anybody is trying to harm them. And it might also make it difficult for them to form relationships with people, so they might isolate themselves. They might stay indoors. They can also, because their nervous system is highly aroused, they can find loud noises or somebody shouting highly traumatizing. Those are some of the things they present with, as well as also they can feel depressed and they can experience thoughts of suicide. How we help people who have been tortured at Freedom from Torture is often in an individual therapeutic relationships and group treatments. Those are the two main types. Individual treatment is the mainstay of the treatment we offer people. That is where the client will come and see us on a one-to-one basis, often on a weekly basis, and they have the chance to talk about in confidence some of the things that have happened to them, some of the frightening things, and that being able to talk about what happened can be part of the healing process, because they can start to integrate some of the memories, some of the experiences that have hurt them for the first time, because they actually feel confident enough to and safe enough with the therapist to actually go back in time and to re-explore them and to start to learn to live with some of the fears that have been created within them. In group therapy, some people prefer it because they prefer to actually have the solidarity of about 15 people. They don't particularly want the intensity of a one-to-one type of treatment. So they might not talk in the group, they might not talk about the particular trauma that's happened to them, but they might share ways of how they've coped in this country, how they've learnt to deal with some of the frightening things that have been done to them without getting too specific. And the group provides a secure place where they actually feel liked, they feel wanted. It actually feels a little bit like family for some of them, and it's a chance where they can share ideas and get a sense of solidarity, feel that they're not on their own, that there are people out there who care, and also like-minded people who can give them some sort of support.
I was tortured upon return to Sri Lanka because I was living here, and I had the news of a family member being taken away, and I went against advice because I wanted to know the truth and I wanted to find out what's gone wrong. And I was taken away by the authorities there under the assumption that I was involved. As you know, there's a strong diaspora of Tamil community in England, and they assumed that I was involved with the LTT, which I was not. And it's purely a classical case of being at the wrong place at the wrong time, and I was taken in and tortured. It was a quite horrific experience, which I really don't want to relive again in my memory, but I am telling this because no one should go through this pain, you know. I was done everything pretty much. They ruptured my knee ligaments. They asked me to sign on an empty sheet of paper, which I questioned why, and the answer was they stood on my wrist and broke my wrist and made me still sign. And every shot, every pain, every blow was I'll kill you kind of blow, you know. Change in government is nothing to be excited about because it's only at the high level. The instigators, the perpetrators of torture and the authorities, they're there forever. It's a career job and the mentalities don't change, and it's ingrained within society to instill fear amongst people to get away with their ideologies at that time. So in the international community has to keep up pressure to find out answers for who have been tortured in accordance to international standards of law and fair trials, rather than the local system which is in place, which is not suited, in my opinion, because people don't have the trust in the system, because the system in itself led all these atrocities to happen in the first place.